Thank you for joining us for our third town hall. We have already hosted both Dominique Anglade and Colin Standish, and tonight we are pleased to welcome Monsieur Éric Duhaime, the leader of the Conservative Party, le chef de Parti Conservateur. Next week, we will be hosting Balarama Holness of Bloc Montréal. I should point out that we are disappointed that our invitation has so far fallen on deaf ears with regards to the leaders of Coalition Avenir Québec and the Parti Québécois. Québec Solidaire has suggested that one of its candidates be its representative, an offer we have refused. As I have stated at our previous town hall meetings, the Quebec Community Groups Network is committed to ensuring that English-speaking Quebecers are aware of the programs of the different political parties. These town halls, our platform, and the questions we have asked the party leaders are a key part of the effort. Our other mission, of course, is to urge English-speaking Quebecers to have their voices heard at the ballot box. With Election Day 4 weeks away, I wish to remind community members of key dates. You have from between September 12 and 29 to ensure that you are on the electoral list. The advanced polls are on September 25 and 26. And of course, Election Day is Monday, October 3rd. We are posting an ad from Elections Quebec in the chats so that you have easy access to the details. Before turning the evening once again over to our moderator par excellence, Royal Orr, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the Quebec Community Groups Network and its member organizations carry out their activities on partially unceded lands and territories, which were the traditional homes and gathering places for many Indigenous nations whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. The QCGN acknowledges our First Nations have a long and rich history of occupation and stewardship of these lands that long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. The QCGN's recognition and respect for the history of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people is an important step towards building trust and creating and renewing relationships with contemporary Indigenous peoples and communities. Now I'll turn it over to Royal.
Thank you, Eva, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this latest town hall. Our guest today is Éric Duhaime, who was elected leader of the Conservative Party of Quebec in April 2021. Previously, Mr. Duhaime had, among other things, hosted a radio show and been a columnist for both the Journal de Montréal and the National Post. But from what most people have observed, politics has always been his passion. Mr. Duhaime has served as a political advisor to Stockwell Day, Mario Dumont, and Gilles Duceppe, and he ran for the ADQ back in 2003. Before asking Mr. Duhaime to speak, let me briefly outline the plan for this evening. We've given Mr. Duhaime about 10 minutes for opening remarks. We'll then engage in a conversation with him for about 40 minutes. The discussion is to be divided into 4 topics: rights and access to justice, education, health and social services, and the vitality of Quebec's English-speaking community. Those of you listening in are encouraged to suggest questions for Mr. Duhaime in the Q&A function. As a matter of fact, that's the main point of this evening, is to get your questions and see what Mr. Duhaime has to say. We'll be taking them as each topic is brought up. So we'll be only receiving questions on education when education is the topic of discussion, just to give an example. Please note that all attendees were automatically muted as they entered the event. You will not have the option to turn on mics or video cameras. Please keep both your questions and your answers short. I guess that's for Mr. Duhaime, so we can get to as many of them as possible. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send an email to events@qcgn.ca. And now I'd like to welcome Mr. Duhaime and call on you, sir, to give us your opening remarks. 10 minutes or so for that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Orr. Thank you to the Quebec Community Groups Network. It's a great pleasure being with you tonight. As you might know, today was an important day for the Conservative Party of Quebec because I wanted to talk. I had a special message for non-Francophones in Quebec about the protection of French here in Quebec and about the historical rights that your community enjoys and need to enjoy in the future. The Conservative Party of Quebec has a very different approach than all the other parties that you're used to regarding the language issue in Quebec. We define ourselves as a nationalist party, a positive nationalism that is inclusive, and we do see the English community or the non-Francophones in Quebec as our allies, not as opponents or enemy, to promote and to protect French in Quebec. We've been, as you probably know, the first political party in Quebec to reject Bill 96 that was tabled by Mr. Legault last year. And the first reason why we opposed it right away, as soon as we read it once, we didn't even finish reading the full bill, that we understood that when you're subtracting 38 articles from the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to any community in Quebec, you're not doing something positive, especially not after the last 2 years we had where our rights and freedoms have been violated like never before in Quebec's history. So for us, that was a no-go. And we didn't flip-flop. And I know the Liberals went back and forth and even proposed amendments that were even worse than what the bill was proposing initially. And at the end of the day, we see Bill 96 for what it is. We do believe it's a political tool for the Coalition Avenir Québec, François Legault's party, to attract more Parti Québécois supporters. And we saw it as an attempt to poke the English community, to exacerbate tensions, to create a new division so the CAQ could be on the side of the French majority. We found that very irresponsible, and we do not believe that today French is better protected in Quebec with Bill 96 than it was before Bill 96 was adopted. So, but that being said, we also saw lately the statistics by Statistics Canada, underlining the decline of French in Canada and in Quebec. We saw that. We think it's very important to address that issue as a minority in North America. If I become premier on October 3rd, one of my main duties will be to make sure that we protect and promote French in America. And I think that I see many Anglophones as our allies in doing so. When I looked at the statistics a little bit more deeply, what we see is that if French is declining in Quebec, it's not the Anglophones' fault. It's not even the Francophones' fault. They're not assimilating to English. It's because Francophones and the majority is not able to attract newcomers at a higher percentage. And we see that many immigrants prefer to be integrated within the English community. And that's the duty of the government to do something about that, to make sure that we keep our percentage of population and we don't feel threatened by disappearing, because that's always been the concern of many Quebec nationalists. The difference between me and other so-called nationalist party is that we do not believe in coercive measures. Personally, I think we have to incite Anglophones to join us. We have to do it in a positive way. I do believe that times have changed. 2022 is not 1972. We're in a new paradigm right now in Quebec. I've met the school board authorities on the English side lately, and I was really impressed when I heard that 75% of parents, non-Francophone parents in Quebec, choose to send their kids to French school, bilingual schools, or French immersion programs. I think that shows a huge openness from your community to our common language here in Quebec. And we have to take that into account. We all agree that French is the current and the main language in Quebec. I think there's very, very little people who contest that nowadays. And I understand and I see that a strong majority of Anglo-Quebecers are proud of being part of the uniqueness of Quebec and the fact that we live in a different society than the rest of the continent. And that also needs to be taken into account. More specifically, I want to tell you a little bit more, something more personal on my side. I'm a kid of parents who do not say a word of English. My parents, when I was a kid, decided to send me to an English kindergarten because my mom was a school bus driver. My father was a sheet metal worker in the construction industry. They had very little education, but they wanted to offer their kids what's best in life. And they understood that being bilingual is a richness. And I hope everybody understands that today in Quebec on both sides, Anglophone and Francophones. It's not, and so my parents did huge sacrifice to make sure I was sent to a private kindergarten. And that's why today I'm talking to you. And that's probably why I had the career I had. And I had the opportunity to work overseas. So even if French is our common language, we have to understand and we have to promote the fact that being bilingual at an individual level is a richness. And we shouldn't be ashamed to say that on both sides, in both communities. I also want to say that times have changed, not just linguistically, but constitutionally as well. And it's often been linked together here in Quebec over the last few decades. The upcoming election in 27 days could be very historic, and Anglophones could have their word to say. For the first time in our lifetime, it could be an election where we put aside a huge fight of the past, the feuds of the past, with a no camp and a yes camp. As you know, polls are indicating right now that the Liberal Party of Quebec is under 10% among Francophones, and the Parti Québécois is under 10% all over the place. So the two old parties who used to dominate, actually it was the only two parties when I was younger, those two parties are in very, very bad shape. And on October 3rd, at the end of the night, they could become both fringe parties. And I think it's an opportunity and it could be a good news for the English community. Why? Because the Liberals have taken your voices for granted for way too long. And a community that is hostage of one single party ends up that the party doesn't listen to you because they take you for granted like the Liberals did. And that explains why they betrayed you on Bill 96. And on the other hand, the other parties don't want to talk to you. And you have a proof now. The Premier doesn't even want to do a debate in English, doesn't want to address the Quebec Community Groups Network because he does believe that he doesn't need you anyway. You're going to vote Liberal. So you're between a rock and a hard place where you're losing on both sides, and politically you have no weight. What the Conservative Party is proposing right now is an opportunity for the English community to find back your political weight, to give yourselves a strong hand within Quebec. And for that, I do believe that if you were participating in the emergence or the rebirth of the Conservative Party of Quebec, you would gain on both sides and you would be more respected and people will have to listen to you. So I wish that we were going to have a few members from English constituencies on October 3rd. I'm not doing it because I conducted polls, by the way. You have to know that first off, I don't have money to conduct polls. We're a new party. We don't have the old tricks of the old parties. We're doing it based on principles. And we might lose votes at the end of the day, especially among the Francophone community, and we might not get any votes in the English community. But we're going to keep our stand because we truly believe that our individual rights, our civic rights, and our individual freedoms need to be defended. And we're going to fight for you. And hopefully, some of your members of your community can be part of our new alliance. And I do believe that the English community in Quebec would do a mistake to end up all in a fringe party, being the two smaller new parties, or even the Liberal who could become a fringe party at the end of the day in 27 days. So we're offering you an opportunity to be part of a coalition that is also part of French Quebec, because as you know, our stronghold is in Quebec City. And I think we can do a historic alliance that could be very good for the future of Quebec based on a new deal. Our new deal is to protect French via immigration. I'll give you examples of what we want to do, but also protect your rights as Anglophone of all Anglophones in Quebec. And by doing that, we think it's important to repeal Bill 96. Unlike the Liberals, we don't think it's time to amend it. I think Bill 96 it has become the symbol of division in Quebec. So there is things we want to do for immigration, but it shouldn't be part of the Bill 96. Bill 96 in my book is contaminated. So what we're proposing to the English community is more on the immigration side, because that's where Francophones feel threatened, and that's where they need to be reassured. And for that, we're proposing mainly three measures. First, to repatriate our powers from the federal government on immigration in a non-partisan and non-separatist way to make sure that we have a cohesive policy regarding immigration in Quebec. Then we can also select our immigrants based on the fact that they're francophones or they're willing to learn French. And thirdly, enhance the inclusive programs for new immigrants, for those who want to accelerate the knowledge of French. So put more resources for them to make sure that they could learn French, because many of them want to, but there's a lack of resources. So those are the three things that we would do to make sure that we're promoting French, but also we're respecting all Anglophones in Quebec. I know I took a little bit more time than expected, but I'm sorry I don't speak very fast tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Duhaime. And let's move on now to our four topics, starting with, and we've heard quite a bit already on this from you, Mr. Duhaime, on the question of rights and access to justice. We are taking your questions. Use the Q&A function here on the Zoom platform. We're asking you as well to include your name and where you're writing from, just so we have a bit of a sense of where the question's coming from and who it's coming from. And we're going to get into Bill 96 in a little bit more detail in a moment, but just before we get to the first question, Mr. Duhaime, what about Bill 21? You spoke pretty clearly about your intention with Bill 96, but both in terms of rights and access to rights and the Charter of Rights, but also in terms of attracting immigrants, what is your stand on Bill 21 and specifically on the hijab, kippah, turban issue?
Well, we do believe in religious freedom, obviously. I've always been someone who's protecting the right to practice our religious beliefs in the private space and sector. That being said, it's a division between the rights of a citizen to receive a neutral service from the state vis-a-vis the right of a religious person to expose their religion as public servants. And on that front, the party historically was against Bill 21 when it got introduced. Personally, I've always been in favor of it. I do believe that it's a good compromise to have a bonne entente. So there's no, everybody could practice their religion the way they want, but if they're working for the state and they're representing the state vis-a-vis a citizen, the citizen has a right to have a neutral service.
But what about the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause? Do you support that? Because that's in 21 as well.
Yeah, but there's two things here, because when we're talking about the notwithstanding clause, the bill was part of an election campaign. Also, there's a democratic legitimacy that the Bill 96 does not have. As you know, there was huge debates, politically speaking, on that specific bill. It was one of the main ballot questions 4 years ago, and a strong majority of Quebecers do support that bill. Even many Anglophones and non-Francophones support that bill. So there has been a democratic debate, and the majority has been in favor of it. We can reopen it. I'm a Democrat. I mean, we can always have those debates, and I welcome them. That's what politics is all about on any issues. That being said, I think that even if we revisited it tomorrow, the majority of Quebecers would still be in favor of Bill 21.
Okay, but so in effect, you are not rejecting the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause. You're saying that that's okay if the majority says
the
okay.
Notwithstanding. I mean, we can use the notwithstanding. It's okay for our government. It's part of our constitution. It's a basic right. What I didn't like about Bill 96 is that they deprived people from going in front of the courts, and that bugged me, because we're not talking about and especially with the timing when it arrived. Many of us felt that our Charter of Rights and Freedoms have been disrespected over the last 2 years, and to introduce such a bill in the middle of a crisis by the government, by the Legault government, I thought the time was really inappropriate. And Anglophones, even no matter if you agree with Bill 96 or not, at least you should have a right to go in front of a court and defend yourself and explain why you think your rights have been violated. And unfortunately, right now, you can't do that.
Okay, so we've got a first question from Erwin. The question he poses to you is, I think your answer has been pretty clear on this, but do you oppose all of Bill 96? Should you be elected as an opposition leader or the leader of the government? What specific steps would you take to have Bill 96 repealed? I mean, if you get in there and you've got the kind of group that you need to be the official opposition, what are you going to do?
Well, I disagree with Bill 96. I think it was crystal clear. We will repeal it. We will vote to make sure that we eliminate that bill, and we will start from scratch. And what we're going to start on is a bill to make sure that we have rules and we have tools to better integrate our immigrants to the French majority. I think that's what we need to work on, and not poke the Anglophones like Bill 96 does in many ways and forms and shapes. And that's, and I hope we can do it with the English community. I'm a Democrat. I hope everybody's going to be around the table and we can find a consensus. We know that it's a very divisive issue. We spent 50, 60 years to split ourselves on linguistic battles here in Quebec. It's time to move on. And for that, it's always very fragile. Everybody's trying to push a bit more and more, but we have to make sure to find a consensus and stop trying to push the envelope on both sides.
Okay, so next question from Josh Como. He asks, as someone who values personal freedom, what do you say to people who say that my freedom to be in public without unnecessary health risks is more important than someone's freedom to be in public without a mask? Basically getting into the COVID-19 issue, which of course has been very front and center in terms of you and your supporters in your concerns about the rights of Quebecers.
Look, I wouldn't be in politics if our rights and freedoms have not been violated that badly over the last 2 years. The reason why I decided to come back to politics is because I felt that there was no party anymore that was representing people like me. And you're right, it did bring us a lot of support initially. You have to know that the rise of the Conservative Party in Quebec is very impressive. We went from 500 members a year and a half ago to over 60,000 members as we speak. We are now the largest party in Quebec in terms of membership. We are the party that has the biggest amount of donors in 2022 in Quebec. We're the party that went from almost 0 or 1% to 19% currently. So, I mean, we went through such a growth because of those measures, obviously, because we were opposing it and we wanted more freedom. That being said, to answer the question a little bit more clear, when you want to violate the rights and freedom of someone, you have to prove that it's absolutely necessary, and that if you're not doing that, the other people's health or life is at risk. We did not prove that during the crisis, and that was a huge problem. We knew that some subgroups were at risk, but there's never been the proof, for example, that a curfew was saving lives, or even that the mask was making a huge difference, especially when you're outside. The mask could be a good barrier, but you have a right to wear it. But if you want to violate the rights of others, you have to prove without a doubt that it's an absolute necessity.
Well, it's not possible to prove without any doubt a scientific question like is health compromised or not. But to get back to the key point of Josh's question, he says, isn't it my right not to be unduly compromised, potentially compromised in terms of my health by people who insist that they shouldn't have to wear a mask? So, I mean, his point is it not a right to be safe?
You're right that it's never 100%, but you need to be minimally a minimum of science when you justify those decisions. When the government, for example, decided to impose us a curfew, there's been not one single study that was based on to show that it was having a positive impact. We asked for all sorts of study. At the end of the day, the only thing they introduced and they presented to us was a poll. I'm sorry, but the methodology of the poll could be scientific, but the poll is politics, and the decisions were very political. And I also recall Mr. Arruda when he came out and said that he never recommended to shut down the restaurants, and François Legault was saying that he was shutting down the restaurant based on the recommendation of public health. So there's been a lot of politics, and we wish that crisis would have been managed with a little bit more science and less politics.
Okay, Mr. Duhaime, just a last question on this point, because we're talking about COVID now and people's resentments about being forced to wear masks and do other things. And you, I think earlier in your remarks, sort of alluded to the last couple of years being, in your eyes, one of the biggest compromising of human rights in Quebec history. But you have said that you see your mandate as bringing the discontent of the population into the walls of the National Assembly. The word you used in French was la grogne. Do you still see that as your main mandate? Is it really about bringing la grogne into the National Assembly?
It's always the mandate of an efficient opposition. You're always trying to look at people who are unsatisfied of the government and make sure that their ideas are brought within the National Assembly. This is what democracy is all about. If you're very satisfied of the government, usually you don't run for opposition, you run with the government. When I don't know, when the separatists were running against the liberals, it's because they felt unsatisfied of federalism. When the mergers happened, many of you were not happy and were unsatisfied, and made sure the liberals got elected to get rid of those who imposed the mergers. So it's often like that in politics, and it's great to be like that. And this is very democratic in my book.
Okay, thanks for those questions. Let's move on to the next topic, which is education. We already have a question, so let's go right to that from Michael Zatinsky in Westmount. Will you commit, Mr. Duhaime, to restore Dawson College's expansion project, which is so important to the heart and soul of English-speaking Quebec? This was a project that would have led to more nurses being put in the health system. The Quebec Liberals initiated the project. The CAQ supported it at the beginning, then pulled the rug out from under it. Will you restore it, yes or no?
I have two. It's a little bit more complicated than yes or no. The first thing is that the funding of our colleges should be even, no matter what the language is. And just the fact that we're debating, let's say, if there's a project that has been approved or disapproved at the Cégep Limoilou in Quebec City, there's never such a fight on both sides saying we're discriminated against, or you're in favor of a minority, you're giving them too much. Those things should not happen. It should be an objective decision. There shouldn't be politics behind that. No matter if your language, your mother tongue is French or English, if the institution is French or English, the funding should be the same. I've seen on one side the separatists saying that Anglophone institutions are overfunded. On the other side, we see Anglophones saying that their institutions are underfunded. I'm not 100% sure who's saying the truth here, but obviously somebody's not saying the truth, because it can't be both. So we have to look at it with a very cold head and go with the data, and it shouldn't be infected with a language or a linguistic fight. And unfortunately, it's been that over the last few months. And I don't think that's exacerbating the tensions again between both our communities. And the decision should not be based on language. It should be based on the funding per student.
Okay, so just a clarification on this. At this point, it sounds to me like you're saying you're not sure whether or not you would approve the Dawson College expansion. At this point, you don't feel you have the kind of information you need.
Well, I don't know if you have it, but I've been asking those questions for months, and it seems that you have to believe what people are saying on one side or the other, and you have to pick sides. I don't want to pick sides just because they're French or because they're English. I want to make sure that the funding is per student, period, no matter what their mother tongue or the language of the college is.
Okay, so earlier we've got a question here about Bill 21 and an aspect of Bill 21. Earlier, you were pretty clear that you were okay with the consensus, which was that when you're receiving services from the state, that should be religiously neutral or not have any kind of religious affiliation in terms of religious symbolism. So here's though, I mean, and many people in the English-speaking community think that even if you kind of support that position, carrying that to the level of teachers in classrooms is too far. So here's a question from Rosemary Murphy, who is president of the Quebec Federation of Home and Schools Association. If your party comes to power, Mr. Duhaime, will you make an exemption to Law 21 regarding the wearing of religious symbols for teachers?
It's a good question. What I'm going to say on this is that because that's true on many bills actually, but if there's some members, and that's why if we get elected in different constituencies, that there's different groups within those communities, if they can prove that the majority of their constituents agree or disagree with amendments or even with the bill altogether, I would let my members be free to vote according to their constituents instead of according to the party line. I've always been a Democrat. I do believe that a member of the National Assembly or a member of Parliament in Ottawa should represent first and foremost their constituents. They're not representative of the party on their constituents. So I would let them vote freely on that issue.
Okay, but what's the party's position right now? That you would maintain the ban on teachers wearing religious symbols?
Well, for now, the consensus was that we're supporting Bill 21. That's what we've adopted, and so we didn't split it or we didn't debate any amendments. So that you're talking about right now.
So you mentioned that you had earlier today or earlier in the campaign spoken with representatives from school boards, at least one school board. I guess it was the big Montreal school board. Bill 40. I'm sure you heard about Bill 40 in those conversations. So what's your stand on Bill 40 and the English-speaking community's right to control and manage its own schools, which at least historically we have recognized as being constitutionally protected?
Well, first off, I have to tell you that I'm not a big fan of bureaucracy. On the French side, I was in favor of abolishing the school boards, but I understand that for Anglophone community, it represents something else, and it's not, they want to make sure that it preserves something that they're controlling, and we should respect their will to keep their school board if that's what the majority wishes. So I don't think we should interfere. I think it's the Anglophone community that needs to decide which institution and how they want to manage it and how they want it to be organized. And I'm going to respect what those people want. And so if they want to keep their own school board, then go for it.
So that's the position of the Conservative Party of Quebec, that you support, to the extent the community supports it, you support management and control through our school boards of our schools.
And if at one point you disagree and you want to decentralize and you prefer having your schools controlling it or something in between, we can be open. But it should, I like things that come, bottom up. I like it when and that's something I always admired from many Anglophone communities in Quebec, is the fact that they have a sense of community at a local level, and for me that's something much better than having the nanny state coming and telling you what to do and how to do it.
What about the extension of Bill 101 controls of access to the CEGEP level of education? What's your position on that?
I do believe that adults, it's very. There's something that bothers me a lot when I see a government who's telling adults in which language they should have their courses. I understand for kids, but for adults, I have a huge problem with that. I think at the end of the day, it's the freedom of choice. That being said, if I were premier, I can tell you that I would go among Anglophone students and recommend them and tell them and try to even have new programs and new incentives for them to go to French colleges and French universities. I would do it from positively, I would never oblige anybody to do that, but I think it's a richness to be bilingual. And I think it's, they have an opportunity. They're lucky to live in Quebec because they could master a second language perfectly. And I would incite those kids to go and to do a year or two in college or universities in Quebec in French. We always talk about the Francophones going to Anglophone institution. I think it's great. I did it myself, but I think Anglophones need to do it even more. We talked about primary and elementary school earlier, but we need to also promote that at the college and university level as well.
So you went to college or university in English?
Well, I did courses here and there, yes.
Okay.
In the institution.
I just wondered which university that was.
No, I didn't.
Okay, so we've touched on Bill 101, so let's continue. One of the historic demands of the English-speaking community has always been extending the so-called Canada Clause for access to school in English internationally. That is to say, if an immigrant arrives here and they're building their life here and they come from India, the United States, wherever, and they did their schooling in English growing up, would you consider allowing those parents to send their children to an English language school?
Well,
Or would you maintain the blanket, no immigrant, nowhere from nowhere gets to go to English language schools?
they could do it in private schools, but not in public schools. I believe that if the parents want to fund 100% of the education of their kids, they can already do it. But if regarding the state's offer, there's something that everybody agrees on, and if we reopen that can of worm, we're back in the fights and the linguistic fights that we're trying to escape. So I don't think it's a good idea to go there. And again, we're going to hit a strong majority of francophones who are going to oppose it.
But isn't there a basic unfairness here, Mr. Duhaime? The French-speaking community has the right to renew itself and its institutions, key institutions like schools, through immigration. But in effect, the English-speaking community can't do that. We don't have access to those immigrants, at least in terms of benefiting from them and reinforcing our schools. Isn't that kind of unfair?
Well, you're right, Mr. Orr, regarding that there's two rules at play, but you also have to take into account that francophones outside of Quebec, when you look at the assimilation rate, I don't think anglophones should look at them as a model. I don't think that's what you guys want for the future of your community. So it's not, the realities are very different. The attraction of English is much different than the attraction of French in North America, and we have to take that into account when we make such decisions.
All right. Thanks to everybody for your questions on education. We're moving on now to our third topic, which is health and social services. Once again, use the Q&A function here on the Zoom platform to send us your questions for Éric Duhaime, who is the leader of the Quebec Conservative Party. We will be using those questions as we continue our conversation. Mr. Duhaime, health and social services. We seem to be in a perpetual crisis in terms of access to doctors, as many party leaders are pointing out. Mr. Legault had promised that every Quebecer would have access to a doctor, and we're worse off than when he made that promise. What is the policy and the approach of your party on the issue of access to healthcare? And let's start with that key core challenge of making sure we can get access to doctors.
Well, the Conservative Party of Quebec has a very different approach. I'm just going to talk about the doctors, and I'll come back to the private healthcare system afterwards. Regarding physicians, in the long run, we do believe that we need to increase the number of physicians by 2,000 in Quebec. And the reason is that we looked at the ratio of doctors per population, and Quebec standards are very, very low, especially compared to the communities the models that we looked at and we really liked, like the German model, the UK model, or the Swedish model. We need to increase the number of physicians per population for us. But of course, you can't do that overnight. In the short term, one of the things we can do is to recognize immigrants who come from overseas with their diploma. There's been protectionism a lot for those people who are arriving in Quebec right now. We've all met people who have a degree as physicians and who can't work in Quebec. We need to fight against that protectionism. And I'm not saying that we should allow everybody who has a diploma from any university around the world to be a physician in Quebec's hospitals, but we need to test them to make sure that they meet the standards. I don't want to lower the standards, and if they need to do more training, we should do it. We should make it accessible for them. But I think it's time to stop protectionism on that side. So that's for the physician side. Regarding the healthcare system as a whole, we went from one reform to the other over the last 40 years with the three parties in power. And unfortunately, it's worse than ever. All those reforms did not translate into a more efficient system. We do believe that it's time for now to look at the elephant in the room. Our public monopoly can't deliver the great services that we should expect. Quebecers are spending $1 billion a week for a healthcare system that can't treat people properly. The waiting lists are unacceptable. As you rightly pointed out, 800,000 Quebecers right now do not have a family physician, and they're on waiting lists as we speak. That's completely unacceptable. What we're saying is that it's time to decentralize the system. It's time to introduce some competition between our health facilities. and it's also time to add the contribution of the private sector. Of course, we're under the rule of the Canada Health Act, and we don't want to change it. We want to make sure that there's a public insurance for everybody, but the provider of services does not need to be public. We could have some private institutions, private clinics, private hospitals with offering services. And if the state in its public service is not able to offer you the treatment that you need and there's reasonable delay, you should have a right to cross over and go to the private facility, just like they do in many European countries. So that's what we're proposing in this election campaign.
Just the other day, Mr. Legault seemed to open the door to the same kind of solution, more private sector.
Thank you to the Conservative Party's race.
Well, that's always kind of fair game in an election campaign, isn't it? Somebody goes out front and then they steal your ideas. But here again, pretty deep. There's a very deep commitment to the current system that we have in place, Medicare, and to step away from that causes a great deal of fear amongst many Canadians and many Quebecers. Are you not taking a big risk by putting private sector healthcare onto the table as a possibility for your government?
I ran for the leadership of a party that was at 1% in the poll. So taking risks I'm not scared of taking risks in life. I can tell you that. Look, this is what we believe in, and this is the way we think we can solve the problem and get out of the dead end that we're stuck in. And I understand that it's a sacred cow. I understand that many people take a lot of pride because it's a very strong difference between Canada and the US. But what we're proposing is not the American model at all. We're proposing European models that are much more efficient and where states are even bigger and larger than they are here in Quebec and in Canada. So, we have to stop being scared of Americans, and we should start looking at what's going on elsewhere around the world.
But I think that one of the big concerns about moving in the direction of private care or private sector-based care is that there's an unfairness that could happen. If I have money, I can buy a service. If I don't have the money, I'm going to have to wait for a service. I'm not going to get a service. How do you ensure that there's not unfairness built into the system once you open the door to private sector care?
First off, what you're decrying, that if you have money, you can go, and if you don't have money, you can't go. This is the current system, because as you probably know, 20% of our healthcare system right now in Quebec is private, and people who are very wealthy do not go to public facilities already. What we're proposing is that people who can't pay and who can only use, the public universal program insurance, they could also go to the private facility, because they will, if we're not answering them in normal delays, or if the private sector, even if there's no delay, if the private sector is able to provide the services for cheaper than what the government is doing, they can also go to the private sector right away. So what we're proposing is a complete different thinking. We're thinking that the government is a public insurance, but the provider of service does not need to be public. And even better than that, even a public institutions could be managed by private businesses. Many hospitals in Europe are managed by the private sector, even if they're public institutions, because the private management is doing a better job. Competition does work. Incentive for profit does work. We do believe in that system. I don't believe in public monopolies. I do believe in competition.
But in the short term, how do you make sure that doctors, nurses, other health professionals aren't lured by the private sector into their system that they're building, and just make things worse in the public healthcare system as a result?
Well, we think it's going to be much better. I'm going to give you very concrete examples. How many physicians, we all know one or two of them, telling us that they can only do some surgeries 2 days a week. So 3 days a week they can't work because there's a shortage of nurses, or there's no room for them at the hospital. Or if we told them you can work on both sides, private and public, because currently it's 100% public or 100% private. They can't do both. If you open the door to both, what you can do at the end of the day is have more resources that are going to be available. Same thing for nurses. There's thousands of nurses that left the system over the last few years because they were they were fed up of a government that was not respecting them and the conditions they didn't like. And it's not just financial, the conditions, because they were doing compulsory overtime and things like that, and they just left the system. If there was a private facility that could treat people like human beings at a local level, there's probably thousands of nurses that could come back to the system. So what we're talking about is something that could provide better healthcare and more efficient system for it.
Thanks to Josh Como for that question. Incidentally, I think it was a good one, and I think it was a good answer as well. Mr. Duhaime, growing need, it seems, for mental health services. One of the areas where it's just very, very clear that we don't have adequate provision of care. What's your perspective on that? What do you intend to do to try and meet the growing mental health crisis, which has only been obviously deeply exacerbated by the COVID situation?
You're so right. I mean, I go to every rallies. I have people. Last night I was in Charlebourg, a suburb of Quebec City. I have 4 person coming in my arms and crying. I've never seen people this desperate. The lack of socialization, of sports, of work, of seeing their kids suffering had a huge impact on the mental health of many Quebecers. And we need to do something about it. We need, a national, I think there's kind of a national emergency for that. We need to provide care for those people because Quebecers are probably having more problem on that side than ever before. So we will need to put resources on that level and recognize that there's a huge shortage on that side.
Do you think we have the money to actually meet the needs that currently exist? I mean, you talk about 2,000 more doctors. You talk about a huge problem and transferring money into mental health services. Ultimately, that becomes a question of where do the resources come from?
Well, that's a very good question because I think it's important to be fiscally responsible, and I'm a fiscal conservative first and foremost. We want to increase the revenues of the state in Quebec. We want, for example, to exploit our natural resources, including oil and gas. As you know, the Premier of Quebec campaigned on that 4 years ago, and then again, he decided to abandon his promise. And he even adopted a bill to forbid any kind of exploitation in Quebec. With what's going on right now in Ukraine, you know that Russian gas is not getting to Western Europe. Germans were in town last week with a delegation to try to convince us to sell them natural gas. We have a very good quality of natural gas here in Quebec. Unfortunately, we import 100%. We don't produce anything. There's a lot of projects on the table. Unfortunately, the government doesn't want to move. We think it's time to move. If we were going ahead, for example, with an example of a liquefied natural gas in the Saguenay region, a $14 billion investment, just for that project, we could shut down 3 coal factories in Germany, and in terms of environment, it's going to be 60% clearer. So Quebec could have an impact, positive impact economically on our territory, yes, but environmentally worldwide. And and also make sure that we could make money out of it as a government. Another example of what we want to do, we do not believe in the nanny state distributing checks to multinationals. The Quebec government loves to do that. They may even call it a Quebec model. We don't think it's a model at all. We want to stop subsidizing businesses as much as we do. Quebec is more generous on that front than anywhere else. And the third thing, what we want to do is to downsize the bureaucracy. We still believe that there's a way of doing it. And there's a lot of bureaucrats in many ways and forms, not the services to the population, but the bureaucracy we want to cut. It's always ballooning in Quebec. You know that Mr. Legault promised to downsize by 5,000 workers in the last election campaign for the public work. And unfortunately, he did the exact opposite. It increased like never before. It increased by at least 12%. So we want to, those are the 3 ways we think that fiscally we can make both ends meet.
So let's move on to our last topic, which is the vitality of Quebec's English-speaking community. Mr. Duhaime, as you know, There is a thing called the Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers. It's been enhanced in its resources and its reach over the time of this government. If you are elected, what's your intention in terms of the kind of direct subsidizing of community groups in the English-speaking community that comes primarily through the Secretariat?
Well, it's important to subsidize community groups. I'm not going to deny that, and we're going to make sure we're partners. And it's often, even for the government, it's much more profitable than investing in bureaucracy when you're helping community groups. That being said, also, I know there's a lot of question among Anglophones for all sorts of quotas, and I'm not into that. I would just want to be very honest with everyone here. For example, I'm the first openly gay leader of a Conservative Party in Canada's history, provincially or federally. And I hope people vote for me, not because I'm gay, but because they think I'm the best candidate to become the next premier of Quebec. And the same is true for, we're the only party who didn't have a quota for women running as candidates. We ended up with close to 40% of women, but it was not, each of them were chosen because they were the best candidate and because they were recommended locally by the members, not because they were a woman or they were any kind of minority group represented. And even by doing that, we had much more representation. We have candidates that come from over 20 countries right now. We have a very, very diverse team of candidates, and I'm very proud of that. But we didn't have quotas or discrimination programs, positive discrimination to do that. And for me, I know that Anglophones, for example, are underrepresented in the public work in Quebec, as you know, and that's a concern. But I wouldn't impose a quota because I think that would not serve the English community of Quebec. I don't think that's the way to do it. I think that we should promote things. We should, even make sure that everyone is more bilingual and everything. But the quota part, I'm not a big fan of.
Okay, but you raise the issue of representation in the public service for English-speaking people. As you know, it is the community is massively
I know, I just
underrepresented,
said it.
less than 1%. Yeah, I know. So what are you going to do here? I mean, if it's not going to be through a quota or not setting a target, I mean, at least would you set a target to enhance that? At least, somewhere above 1%?
But Mr. Orr, it's also possible that Anglophones, there's less Anglophones in Quebec City and the public work is more in Quebec City. It's possible that many of them prefer working for the federal government or at the municipal level. It could be a matter of addition of individual choices. I don't think there's a systemic discrimination, program in place. And I would make sure there's not. And if ever there is one, I would be the first one to make sure it doesn't happen. But at the same time, we can, as I said, we can open our arms and say, look, we, try to learn French as much as we can, try to promote it, try to incite those people, but we can't oblige to people to be there. And if we were doing that, it could have the reversed impact where people are going to think they're there because they're Anglophone, and that would be even worse for the English community.
So we've got one question. It's a little bit from left field. I'm not left field, I shouldn't say that. It's an important question that doesn't fit directly into vitality, although I have to say it is an issue for people when they're thinking about their futures and where they're going to live out their retirements. This is from Monica in Laval, Mr. Duhaime. My question is with respect to comments you've previously made regarding dismantling Quebec's public pension system. Please advise how this will improve the well-being of the average Quebecer, English-speaking, French-speaking, whatever speaking, not skilled in financial matters, nor having the assets needed to secure the services of a top-notch private pension fund firm. How are you going to try and make sure that if you dismantle or shift the focus for the pension system, that it doesn't end up leaving some people out in the cold, quite literally?
First off, that person is well documented because I did that many years ago for the Montreal Economic Institute. That being said, it was a theoretical study, but it's not part of the platform or any policies of the Conservative Party of today. And I have no intention as premier to implement such a thing. I wrote a policy paper on that at an academic level in a previous life, but it has nothing to do with the Conservative Party and will have nothing to do with our government that we're going to form if we win the election.
Thank you. Mr. Duhaime, thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Before I turn this over to Ava for some closing remarks, we wanted to offer you 3 minutes at the end, Mr. Duhaime, just to kind of wrap things up and give us your final words in terms of your candidacy and your potential premiership and the English-speaking community of Quebec.
Thank you so much for welcoming me, the Quebec Community Groups Network. I think it's important to have a dialogue. I think it's important for Anglophones to, give themselves a little bit more weight in Quebec politics. We have an historic, as I rightly pointed out initially, we have an historic opportunity on October 3rd to change things. Liberals took you for granted for ages. It didn't deserve you. It didn't give you anything. I think it's time to look at it from a fresh start, to give yourself some empowerment. And the Conservative Party could be a great ally. We're a party that's raising. I'm very proud of something also that I've noted in the polls lately. We're equal among Anglophones and Francophones, and it's a reporter that noticed that, and it's very important. There's no difference, no matter what's our language, for the support of the Conservative Party. We're almost at 20% on both sides, in the English community and the French community. The journalist said he spoke to many pollsters. They've never seen that in Quebec politics. Usually a party is either more popular, much more popular among Anglophones, like the Liberals, or much more popular among the Francophones, like the Separatists. But we do not do that. And you know why? Because we do not split on language issues. Because we don't look at people depending if their mother tongue is French or English, or the language they speak at home. We look at them as all Quebecers, and what we're voting on is our future, to have a better healthcare system, to pay less taxes, to exploit our natural resources, to have better kindergartens. These are the kind of issues that we're concerned about, and that's why we want to work all together, no matter what's your linguistic background. So, we have to stop just being on each other's side of the fence. I think things have changed a lot in Quebec over the last few decades. There's never been as many Anglophones and Francophones, for example, getting married together. Our kids have never played together as much. We've never been to the same party as much. We're becoming a true Quebecer, and a true Quebecer looks beyond being French or English. And this is what we now have, a political party that represents that new reality. And I want to reach out to the English community and make sure that we have a few members in the National Assembly who are going to talk about that diversity and that new reality. And I invite Anglophones to think about it, and hopefully you can be part of that new movement, that new trend. You have a great place, and you will be more than welcome to be part of us. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Bonne fin de soirée.
Thank you, Mr. Duhaime. Ava.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Duhaime. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for showing the respect to our community by coming and speaking to us. And thank you for your frankness. And I wish you a good evening. I want to remind our participants out there that they should get on the electoral list, make sure that they know when and where they need to vote, and to go out and vote. And please join us next Thursday, when we will have the leader of the Bloc Montréal, Bahama Holness, who will be joining us. And on that note, I wish everyone a good evening. Bonne soirée. Merci.